Welcome everyone. We have our friends at Black Power Media, and I talk about the reason why we started RBing quite a few times because I viewed the lack of true Black independent media as being a problem. And I remember people would hit me up like, "Yeah, have you seen Black Power Media? Have you guys reached out to our Black Power Media?" And I was like, "Wait, what? There's another there's another independent Black media outlet." So that's why I'm glad we reached out to you guys, and I'm glad that you guys have a space in this independent media space. So welcome to the Activist Summit, Kamu and Two Black.
Peace, man. How you doing? Nice to see you guys.
Yeah, great to have you guys back on here. So I want to bring Kamu in first. I'm gonna go around and have you guys introduce yourself and explain the kind of activism that you guys engage in, and you guys can explain what drove you to engage and become activists yourself, and what kind of radicalized you. Because this is something that I'm always interested in talking to when I'm talking to other fellow Black leftists. So Kamu, we can start with you first if you want to introduce yourself, the kind of activism you engage in, and what kind of radicalized you and spurred you into action.
Sure. So my name is Kamal Franklin. I'm gonna stress
No,
the ow and not the ooh
I
part.
apologize. I
No,
apologize.
that's fine. Just making sure. But I got into organizing. I think because my mom, I tell folks this story. My mom was from Charleston, South Carolina, and she was raised through Jim Crow, and so she would tell us stories about living under that kind of oppression. She had a scar on her back. She passed away earlier this year, but she had a scar on her back since the time she was a child when she was in a whites only playground and was being chased out by a white cop and got hit in the back. And so when you hear stories like that, when you hear about the things that Black folks went through, that stuff starts to make you start thinking about how the world operates, how the world works. Born and raised in Brooklyn, grew up in the projects, and again, just life conditions makes you start thinking about what it is that puts our folks in a certain place. And I think through that, I started reading about the history of the civil rights movement, started reading about Malcolm, and once I started reading Malcolm X, it's kind of like a light bulb went off. Because the same things that Malcolm was talking about in terms of conditions in the 40s and 50s when he was young and grew up, it seemed like from reading those books that the same conditions existed when I was a young person
Yeah.
growing up in the projects. And I know other organizers, activists who tell me the same conditions exist today, obviously. No change has happened. And then when they read something like Malcolm or something else, it resonates. And so it shows that the oppression is continual. And that's what made me jump in and want to be a radical organizer. Been organizing for over 30 years, from New York to Atlanta to at times Jackson, Mississippi.
Wow.
And so that's really what jump started me, and I've been in organizing since then.
Yeah, and you bring up that just things you see in your real life and what your parents would tell you, and pretty much every single Black leftist would tell you the exact same. Like growing up, my dad lived in Alabama. He would tell me about the fights they used to have, like street fights between white gangs and Black gangs. That's something that a lot of people don't talk about. My dad and a lot of my close relatives that used to live in Alabama, they joined gangs just to protect themselves from the violent scourge of white supremacy. And my dad grew up through the 70s and the 80s. He told me about a lot of the racist violence that he even seen back then, and and the racist policies that we was subjected to. So the mainstream narrative, and I don't know if you guys witnessed the same, and I feel like a lot of people can attest to this, where the establishment was trying to pretend, especially after the civil rights era, where they was like, "Oh, everything's okay now. You guys marched in the '60s, racism is ended, Black people and white people are completely equitable now." And my dad was there from day one to tell me, "Yo, don't believe what they're saying. This shit is not over." So that was the influence I always had. I couldn't explain and educate like Marxist lens in terms of what was wrong, but I always knew something was right, and that we still need to be fighting for the Black cause. So that's very relatable what you said. But I want to pass it to Black, the same kind of question, the kind of activism you engage in, and what kind of radicalized and spurred you into action to Black.
Yeah, I'm always bad at answering these kind of questions. I'm gonna
Yeah,
do my
it's a
best.
tough one. It's a tough one.
Uh, but I mean, actually, it's funny. Me and Kamal are both leave. We both should be in an organizational meeting right now. Actually, Black Black Alliance for Peace. It was our conference this weekend. Black Alliance is a pro-peace, anti-imperialist Black revolutionary organization.
Or
Kamal actually spoke, did a great presentation. I'd be interested. I'm not putting you on the spot. You could, after I answer, if you could do your distinction between organizer and activist, I think that would be apropos for this conversation. I know you can't do the whole speech, but it was just good, you know, to hear it. So as far as myself, just kind of playing off that whole activist organizer kind of binary, and again, Kamal could expand on it more. But I think, I mean, I'm from Indiana, still live here. So we call Indiana the Deep North. It's very much reflective of how the South operates. I mean, they sell Confederate flag license plates at the gas station growing up. You know, it's funny when I got to college and people were like, "Oh my God, they have Confederate flags." Like this was normal, you know, based on where I came from. You know, I remember when I was a kid, we were going to school for it was a field trip. It was supposed to be a Civil War field trip, like a Civil War reenactment, and it got canceled because it was a Klan rally at this same location.
Yikes.
That was in a different city, but it was all in Indiana. So I'm just giving that as a backdrop. But like, that's kind of, you know, what I come out of. So for me, the reality of it is just what it is as far as the racism. You know, I grew up, you know, in church somewhat, so I got some of the community kind of sense of like going out and talking to people, even though it's never been my favorite thing to do, but just understanding that you had to engage with people. And that and even if you leave church or it's not really what works for you because it's not really my thing, you do learn a sense of like institution building and, you know, just planning and just organizing just on a day-to-day. Like that's just something, if you are in it, you kind of get some tools from, even if you don't know you're getting it as a kid. I think similar to you, Nick, like my pops was pretty clear with me. Like I remember when 9/11 happened, and you know, he was very much clear like this was bullshit. Like there was something more even before we knew like the weapons weren't real or whatever. Like he was very clear. Like when the, you know, the national security state started to expand, like he was, you know, I remember him bringing home articles and stuff and just telling me that, you know, that wasn't quite how things were supposed to be. But like similar to a lot of folks, I didn't always have the language. I think racism, though, again, for me was pretty clear early on. Like, I mean, I was arguing white people in like 5th grade. Uh, but I had a lot of contradictions. Like some days I'd be on that, other days I was trying to please some kind of stereotype. And I think over time, I started to understand things better as I got more into reading, as I just got more into the day-to-day things. And I think as a poet and doing art was like the first kind of expression for me. But I found, as much as like doing poetry on a lot of these issues that you talk about on this channel and that we talk about on BPM, like you become too much of an individual when you're just performing and you're not really in like community with people. You're in community, but you're not in like a formalized setting with folks. So you're like to the kind of activist thing where you're saying the real shit, you're speaking truth to power, you're doing it on stage, and there's this kind of mythical thought that by doing that, it's just going to transform the room, and then they're going to go do the revolutionary shit, and it just don't work like that. You actually have to go and engage in at least some of the stuff that you put in your poems and some of the stuff. It's not that I wasn't doing that at all, but I didn't understand that pipeline as well when I was like in my early 20s. I think as I've gotten older, I understood the importance of working with people, even if I don't like them, even if we don't agree. Growing up in Indiana, in a red state, there's not a lot of left like ideas that permeate at all. It's just not.
Yeah, I live in Missouri, so I relate. I relate.
Yeah. Like you're not gonna find it. So it's like you're not gonna get, like I had to find these things on my own. And I ran into very few people, and those people I'm thankful for that kind of helped guide me to that. When somebody put me on a Black Agenda report in high school, I'm very appreciative. I think that changed a lot of my trajectory. But I was myself and a lot of my friends were put on, since we were like decent students, we were put on that kind of like Black excellence track. And I kind of rebelled. I rejected like honor roll classes. Like, I didn't want to do any of that shit. Even when I didn't understand, I was like, I don't, because it just alienates you from everybody else. And it puts you as this like token Black or the one above everybody else, and you think you're smarter. And I saw a lot of people get put on that track, you know. So it's like, I don't know, like those things for me, and even being in church somewhat clarified the class element too. Like the early on, like seeing how they separate us and how we get put on this track, and then we think that we're the good black people, and
Definitely.
that always clarified class to me pretty early. So I think that's what prepared me to get into the stuff we're into now, whether that's political prison organizing, whether that's Blackness podcast, whether that's BPM, whether that's BAP or any other things.
Yeah, I talk about this all the time. Like I was a horrific student because I knew that our education was trash. I'm a very intellectually curious person. That's why I tell you I do a lot of reading. I do a lot of research. I always try to prepare really well researched shows, and I do that because I think I'm just interested in constantly learning new things. But when I was a teenager in school and like listening to the bullshit they was feeding us, I knew there was no value in that, and that's why I mostly was a C student. Dropped out of high school because they would tell us stuff, and you guys can probably add to this as well. They'll tell us stuff like Malcolm X was the radical bad one, and they'll whitewash the shit out of MLK, lie about Black history, and that was just the general narrative that I was fed growing up, and I staunchly rejected that. Knew they was feeding this bullshit, and that's why I was very, I was a very mediocre student. But you mentioned this speech you gave at the Black Alliance for Peace, that Two Black, about the difference between activist and organizer, Kamal.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I gave a little talk about um, uh, what is an organizer per se. Like, what does it mean to be an organizer? And one of the things I hit upon was that, every organizer is an activist, but every activist isn't an organizer. And what I meant by that really was that if you're talking about making radical revolutionary change in the Black community, or quite frankly, anywhere, you got to be an organizer and not just an activist. Now, there's certain things that activists bring to the table, as anybody does. If they have certain skills, they show up, they can produce certain things, they can get involved in certain things. But at the end of the day, if you're not in community with like some like-minded people, then those efforts are, let's just say, jilted or stopped or not complete in COIT. They're not efforts that are going to be completed in terms of making some long-term change. And it's really through organizing, of you organizing other people around you, other people in the community, other people at your workplace, organizing folks on the block, right? Organizing folks who go to church. It's really through those efforts and those means that we are able to build organizations that really can mean something in terms of doing work in our community. And so I just wanted to make sure that folks kind of understood that. Didn't want to necessarily shit on folks who are doing activist work, but to me, it's own, like it's in some ways we all have to figure out how do we get involved in movement activities, particularly once we become politicized, once we get involved, when something sort of makes us feel like, oh, there's something we want to do. So that takes some time and effort. But ultimately, for me, in talking about it, it was like really about the organizing efforts of people through organization that builds the possibilities for defeating, fighting back against capitalist oppression, fighting back against white supremacy. And that's just something I think we got to talk more about, know more about, and get more involved in, because otherwise we're doing things in a very sort of sporadic, autonomous way that I don't necessarily think brings to a sort of radical and revolutionary change.
That's a very interesting concept that I definitely gotta dive more into because it's a uh, very once again interesting position to have. The difference between an organizer and an activist, something that we definitely got to talk about. I always advocate because I don't want people to feel depowered because a lot of people work they swamp, hey, have family that they have to engage with all the time. So I always want to stress to people to try to do whatever you can. Everyone has a role in this movement, so that is definitely very interesting. Now I want to ask you guys this because we are in this independent media space, RBN being Black independent media. I think there was a very important need for us to have Black independent media because I feel like there was a large um, gap that was missing. Like even like you not only have corporate media, which is horrible, you had independent media that was the counter to corporate media, but then they start kind of falling in the same line of mistakes, especially with the lack of Black voices that I've noticed. So I'm glad that Black Power Media exists. And I want to ask you guys this. I'll start with Two Black first this time. What do you guys think the role of Black independent media should be in terms of activism, what importance that it has in the movement? If you guys want to take that on very broadly.
I mean, I don't know. I come from the school of thought that all media is propaganda. Not propaganda as inherently bad for those who may
Yeah,
not know the logic, but propaganda that you're dispersing a message, and ultimately that does influence people's ideology, whether you are aware of this or not. So even if I got on here and I just talked about random hip hop songs all day or whatever, like a lot of people unfortunately do on their YouTube shows, like that would still be that a form of spouting ideology, because the way I interpret those songs is going to influence my listeners, right? So if you understand that anything you put out to a vast base of people has some kind of impact on the way they understand the world, then in that sense, like all of it is propaganda. So then it becomes a question of like propaganda for what? Like what do we ultimately try to work towards? So like Black Power Media, like all of us, or at least most of us to my knowledge, are part of organizations, or at least part of some kind of activity that's tied to like some kind of like work beyond just our own individual platforms. Like that's an important thing. So we're not just saying, this is bad or that's bad, but we're also like doing that work so it informs our media work as well. Or we're in conversation with people who are doing that work so it informs our media work, right? So it's like the media should not just be something that is consumed. And I think that that's a problem today, is people just want to consume, and the independent media often, particularly white media, but even overall, I think it's like, okay, now you can consume all the hatred that you might have of the Democratic Party, but you're still here just consuming. You don't really have to do anything other than just talk about how much you hate Democrats or whatever, or talk about how much you hate corporate media. I'm not trying to call out any particular places. I know Nick can probably speak to those places, but it's like, but as far as just like you can consume it, and then that becomes the actual political identity and position, is, oh, I just watch Democracy Now, or I just
yeah,
watch these shows, and that's the actual politic. Versus with Black Power Media, we're trying to help frame work that should already be happening, and push you into that work. Because like I was saying earlier, as an artist, it's not enough for me to do the quote unquote revolutionary poem and then there's not anything for me to point people to. So somebody comes up to me after an event, or somebody comes up to me, going back to Black Power Media, and wants to have an understanding of what to do. Like, even if I'm not involved in everything I talk about, because that's hard to do, I still need to be able to say, hey, they're doing that over there. They're doing this over here. There is resistance. There is people working right now. There are ways to get involved, because that's what we actually need to build any kind of like broad-based revolutionary or even progressive movement. That's what you're going to need. It's not enough to just consume the kind of rage that you feel when you don't see your views represented. Like that is mistaking like the overall goal for like maybe one issue. So like, yes, our views should be represented, but that is not the ultimate win. It's just to have our views represented. We want our views represented for a certain utility so we can actually do something, right? Otherwise it's just its own kind of leftist diversity game, you know what I mean, where it's just like, oh, we talk to Black voices for what? You know what I'm saying? So so for me, like we have to actually actually empower what we're trying to do, and like that pipeline has to exist. And I think that that's something that where even BPM is still learning. Like we don't have that perfectly figured out, or even just my show, Black Miss Podcast. But I think that that's what we should be trying to practice at the very least.
yeah, yeah. I love that perspective because Rome, he would straight out say that he's a propagandist. That he's
Yeah,
trying to get as many black people to communism as possible. And I have said many times, I am the most biased commentator that you will find on YouTube because I am unapologetically advocating for our community. I am
Mhm.
unapologetically I am for advocating for the workers, unapologetically advocating for black people. You guys will always know my perspective. So that was a very interesting take. Like not only just being media, but being media for a reason, have something to point people to. That's why, like we have fun live streams where we talk about fun stuff. But at the end, I always try to tell people like, yo, let's get involved. We can laugh, we can cry on here, but let's try to channel that into true revolutionary change that we want to see. So I love the answer to Black. I want to pose the same question to Kamal. Like, what role do you see that we can play in Black independent media in terms of activism, and what suggestions that you have for us?
Yeah, I mean, I echo everything that Two Black said. I thought it was a brilliant answer. The only thing I would add is that we need to create, part of what we do is to try to create those other narratives, because we don't believe that so-called corporate or mainstream media or even liberal left media necessarily has all the answers or most of the answers or sometimes any answers for what we need to do in the Black community. And so a lot of times, similarly, people they consume media and they think that means that's action, right? Or they think that means that they know something, and so they're informed now, right? So that's good, but it's just not enough. And I think the things that Two Black hit on are essential. Like, so we do what we do so people can jump in and get involved in somehow. They can have more information about where to get involved, how to get involved. It's another perspective that they will not get mostly anyplace else. We have Black folks who are radical, who are also involved in organizing, steeped in different types of organizing. And so I think that stuff becomes extremely important when all day long, most people get fed corporate narratives about how the world works, who's our friends, who's our enemies, what's the state of our condition in America, what our problems are, and how mostly it's our fault that we have problems in the country. So without a counter radical narrative, people feel, even if they think like this doesn't sound right, a lot of times people feel isolated, or they feel like there's no way for them to sort of express alternative views or any place for them to find like-minded people. And again, even if they're just questioning how the world works, if they don't hear the other alternative, they don't read some books, or they don't find something in a magazine, or they don't find us on YouTube or you guys on YouTube or wherever it is, then they're lost, right? And so we help give people that alternative to figure out how they get involved. Like, a complimentary thing that we get, I guess is happening more and more, is that folks will come up and just say, yo, we saw your work on Black Power Media or something you spoke about, and that made me look into this, or that made me look into that, and then I got involved and stuff like that. Yeah. So for me, that's like one of the most important things that we can do by sort of spreading the message or being a part of an alternative media that's particularly radical, Black, nationalist in a lot of ways, talking about we as a lot of folks need self-determination. We need to control not only our narrative, but we need to control our spaces. We need to control our organizations. We could be allies and comrades with everybody and anybody, but unless we control what it is that happens to us, we're always going to be at somebody else's whim, suggestion, idea. And that's something that we as a people need to break away from. So, it's extremely important to be putting out things that folks can grab onto, and then find ways in which people can get involved and struggle.
Yeah, and I would say, just add to that. I mean, like I talked about, even when you asked us about our background and how somebody put me on the Black Agenda Report, which is an online website that publishes, Black left analysis for those who don't know. And it disrupts like a pipeline that a lot of us are on when you're introduced to other kinds of media. Like I said, the school I was in, and some of the people around me was trying to put me on the like Black Leader of Tomorrow pipeline. I never wanted anything to do with it anyway, but I'm just saying, like, they were trying to put me on that kind of, I don't know, some Democrat in the future, or some like congressman or whatever bullshit. Like that's, and it's like, so when I got put on a Black Agenda Report, this is at the same time that Obama was running for president. And for people who are familiar with that time period, or even what Black Agenda Report was into, like they excoriated Obama every week. Like,
so, I wish I would have read it back then, man.
Like Glenn Ford used to excoriate. I mean, it was just, and it was good. It was good analysis. It wasn't like personal, but they excoriated every week. So it got so when I was in school and around other people, I was always in conflict because I'm almost in a different world reading like this critical analysis of Obama. He's a corporate. He works with the corporate donor class. Like he's a shiv for Wall Street. Like that's what I'm reading, and everybody else is getting like, this is the prince, this is the second coming. So that also, like, so reading it and then having to go into the real world and figure that out was its own exercise for me that I appreciated, because it also forced me to think about, okay, yeah, I know this stuff, but I don't want to just, like Kamal talked about this in the speech yesterday. It's not enough to just be smarter than the next person just because you read the radical shit, right? Like, so it's like, how do I figure out how to even talk about half of this stuff I'm learning in a whole different world and bring it to my people, and have a dialogue, even if I ultimately was in a lot of arguments back then. Like, how do I do that, right? But like, I think it's important to, even for media, to do that too. Like, we can't just bang the drum about how much we're being lied to. We also have to figure out, like, what are ways we can converse with the average person, because I think as much as we can disrupt that pipeline that a lot of people get put on that's not part of their choice. Again, you're young, and if they're like, oh, you're kind of smart, they put you on that pipeline. It's even worse today than it was when I was younger. The kind of activist pipeline that they build up for young people to put them into just funnel them into the Democratic Party and into, these so-called, progressive politics, right? Like it's terrible. And it's not just even in America. This happens outside of America as well. So I think like media needs to, like Black media, Black independent left media needs to be able to disrupt that process as much as possible. Like make as many defectors as you can.
Yeah, the example you gave of Black Alliance for Peace, like I really wish I read it back then, where they constantly exposing the truth about Barack Obama. That was desperately needed, because now I call that like the great era of Black liberalism, because Barack Obama unfortunately dragged so many people in our community to the right, where they accepted things they would never have accepted before, and to be honest, he was very successful at that. That 2007 to 2000 maybe 14 era, you can call it the era of Black liberalism, where it was at its absolute strongest. I remember the illusion cracked for me, because I remember being in high school and just in our school, no one ever talked about politics. Like it was something that never came up. Then the election of Barack Obama, it became the thing in school. Like it was the theme of like school. Like who's gonna win this election? Like teachers were talking about it in school, talking about when Barack Obama won, people were dancing and celebrating in the streets. And now looking, in the hallways, I should say. Now looking back, now like man, we was celebrating a guy who was a psychopath, a war criminal, someone who was groomed by Wall Street. And the first thing that like started to chip at me when I realized Barack Obama was a fraud was actually the old school debates like Dr. Cornel West used to have. I still remember like the beef between Michael Eric Dyson and Dr. Cornel West. He took a ton of heat from like the BET Hollywood crowd, because everyone was supposed to fall in line. And
just real quickly, if you go to Democracy Now! and look up Glenn Ford, who was the editor of Black Agenda Report, versus Michael Eric Dyson. And they debated on, was Obama, I think, good for Black people or something. And man, Glenn Ford, again, Glenn Ford, if you put anybody in front of Glenn Ford, he destroyed Michael Eric Dyson. It was embarrassing. Like it was he just mopped the floor. And he did it both years. It was 2008 and 2012. Just wanted people to go watch that. Like it was Michael Eric Dyson's doing all his words and jumping around, and Glenn Ford just like facts. It was
I remember when I was younger, I used to listen to Michael Eric Dyson. I used to be very impressed. I mean, I'm like a young teenager. I'm like, this brother using super fancy words and shit. But then you realize his modus operandi was to sound super smart and then sheep herd Black people to the Democratic Party. And
Dr. Cornel West for 30 years. No, I was going to say quickly, that's been his life for the last 30 years. Just that, I think that's when I started to like Cornel a little bit more again, when he came out against Obama, because in a subtle way for me, up until a certain point, Cornel was also engaging in a certain type of intellectual game where it was more about fame than it was action, right? And so I appreciated when he took what he did not have to do, but he took a little bit back into a left turn, an honest left turn, I should say, and really started going after Obama. And I was going to say, like during that time period, that's when I was already sort of being a little older, like fully politicized. So that's one of the most depressing time periods of my life. When Obama was, because it was like one of those things where you were like, how the hell did this happen? Like out of nowhere, this person comes out, and again, they weren't like a well-known figure in the Black community. Barack Obama was made, right? He was produced. He wasn't like somebody who came up in a certain time period, had certain credentials, certain politics. He was somebody who got scrubbed clean and put in front of cameras and had the great, and he was part of that, right? It wasn't like it happened to him. He wanted it to happen to him. He successfully decided to choose a Black woman from Chicago, who in a lot of ways made all the difference in terms of his being beloved within the Black community. When Barack Obama would talk, he learned the cadence of the Black church. He learned the cadence of Black radicals, and he would use that and infuse that in some of his speeches. So he knew how to excite and delight the Black community. And it was exactly what you said. It was like when Barack Obama won, there were people were in the streets, and it was hard to not be part of it, right? It was hard to be like, you're kicking rocks off to the side, looking like some rejected child.
Yeah.
And the vast majority of your community is out there. So we went out just walking the streets and chatting with people and all that kind of stuff, because you're like it helped us figure out a way, sort of a which way forward after time. It was like, okay, if this is the case, then we should do these other things. And kind of out of that came what, for the organization I was with at the time, something we called the Jackson Plan, was trying to like use the electoral capture fully, the full capture of the Black folks within the Democratic Party. It was already there, but I felt it was fading up into a point, particularly with Bush before him. But Obama just, put it back in steroids, where Black folks, the numbers of voters went up, the numbers of registration within the Democratic Party went up. And that's still something that even to this day, there's more critique and criticism of Barack Obama, obviously within the 8 years in which he was in office, and now the several years that he's out of. But still, there's that tension of like, you say something about Barack Obama, particularly to a mainstream Black audience, let's say, or to a church-going Black audience, you better come with your facts.
Yeah,
you better come with it to deliver
sure.
it. Yeah, you got to be careful about it. You just can't go out, otherwise you lose everybody. You may, and again, like we talked about the other day, you may be right in that argument, but if you're like losing people, then you're the one who's isolated, not Barack Obama, right? So
yeah, it was a tough time. Yeah,
and as the conflict, you are 100% right, because I have receipts on Obama all day, son. I converted, like, so, people that I know, they don't like Barack Obama anymore. But what Kamal brought up is 100% true. It's like weaving a needle. Like, you gotta be very careful with how you do it. And all the people I got to dislike Barack Obama, I didn't come out super hot. Like, it was subtle stuff. Now I introduced concepts, and they slowly went on the board, right? And I cannot emphasize, and this is something that probably is going to be studied throughout history, the effect that Barack Obama had on our generation, Black people political development. Because if you ask almost every person on RBN, maybe Rome is the only exception, like about how we became radicalized, it starts out, and it's mostly our age, right? I'm younger millennial, right? So if you ask anyone around my age, how do you develop your politics? Oh, I thought Barack Obama was good. Turn out I learned that Barack Obama was actually evil. That radicalized me. It's like that same Obama to radicalization pipeline that I think is gonna bite the establishment in the ass in the long term, right? I think in the long term, because I think they turned so many young people off of politics, especially young Black people. Like we all are radicalized, and a lot of Black leftists I talk to are radicalized and done with the Democratic Party after seeing the crimes of Obama, after being sold on the lie of Barack Obama. Now we're like, all right, we need to find other alternatives. And now I want to bring the conversation back to something that you mentioned, Kamal, when you mentioned the term Black termination, because it's something that I've been talking about quite a bit on RBN. And I think this is something that frustrates a lot of white liberals when they listen to us, because I said it many times, we're done listening to white saviors, because I think white saviors and these people in these, I would even say upper class, who infiltrate our communities, and they sheep herd us into having beliefs that is incompatible with our liberation, like voting for a Democratic Party is one example. The most recent example is Black Lives Matter as an organization, which, and if you guys want to disagree and put it back, feel free. But I think it started off with good intentions, but then was infiltrated by white saviors in the Democratic Party. It was reported that Hillary Clinton Democrats essentially took it over. And the reason why I tie that with Black termination, because you mentioned how like we need to start charting our own path. We need to stop listening to these people. And I wonder if I get that right. I want to ask you to expand on that. What you mean on Black termination? Why you think that's so important?
Well, when I talk about Black self-determination, what I mean is that we as a people should be in charge of what it means for us to be liberated. That we, again, allies, comrades, and the rest of it is obviously something that we want to have. Being Pan-Africanist and internationalist, working with folks who are like-minded is something that we need to do. But too many times in our own history as Black folks who are struggling around issues of what it means to fight back against oppression, whether or not they are, extreme right-wing, or whether or not they're even extreme left-wing, right? And I'm extreme left-wing myself. But a lot of times folks are more interested in having us be subsumed into somebody else's power structure. So whether or not that's a communist power structure, whether or not that's a right-wing power structure, we ourselves need to decide who our friends are. And even on the left, right, when we decide who our friends are, what is the interplay between us and our friends? Do our friends get to dictate what we do, how we do it, when we do it, just because they got cash or just because they have a bigger audience or whatever it is? The clear answer is no. If you're an ally of ours and you understand our struggle, the struggle of Black folks is not just to make us sort of subsumed within the apparatus of something that you're doing or your style of leadership or what you think what you think we should be doing in terms of fighting back or how we should fight back, right? Those things that we have to be a free people and a liberated people, in a sense of we have to be able to have voice and give voice to how we're going to interact with other groups, other folks, other revolutionary strugglers, other radical strugglers, because without that, we are just captured by folks. And I think that's unfortunately part of the long history of, particularly here in the United States, of how folks see Black people vis-a-vis the fight against white supremacy and or the fight against capitalism. And I think that's why we got to take a very hard stance on creating our own organizations, our own media outlets, our own ways of organizing ourselves, our own institutions, so that we can have far more control and dictate what we as a people in general, right, think that which way forward for us and how we interact with our kind of fellow leftists or fellow folks who are walking on the same, hopefully walking on the same road that we are.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for expanding on the idea. Very well said. I want to take the time to pass it to two black. To two black. We got about 15 minutes left. You guys have done a lot of great activism and spreading awareness on political prisoners. I saw that Kamal and you guys covered Mumia. We also did a segment on that. I think that's something that is not talked about enough. We did a live stream talking about the Pendleton too. So since we're on the Activism Summit, assuming that people did not see that live stream, Two Black, do you want to chime in about your activism with political prisoners, why you believe that's so important, and how people can help other political prisoners if they're interested in that?
Yeah, I mean, just how we always talk about this, political prisoners, for people who don't know, are people who have been, punished beyond any crime they may or may not have committed. They've been punished way beyond that, much more drastically, for taking a political line. So, you could go out and take Skittles from a store, and if you also are involved in some kind of political organizing, you might get 30 years for that. It might sound cartoonish, but that's how usually this goes. Or you didn't do anything at all, and the state will make up a crime, like with Mumia, and then sentence you to, death row, or life in prison. It can also become politicized in prison, which is when we get to the Pendleton too. That's what we're talking about, as in you can be in prison for whatever so-called crime they said you committed, petty theft, assault, whatever. And then maybe you rise up against the prison guards, against the institution, the Department of Corrections, etc., and you are sentenced, much longer, like for 100 years, because you rose up against the guards or you helped try to organize prisoners inside it. So anyway, either way, you took a political line that was against the state, that wasn't in the interest of the state, and you were punished for it ultimately. So with the Pendleton too, we're talking about two gentlemen, Christopher Naeem Trotter and John Balagoon Cole in Indiana. We're talking about in Pendleton, Indiana, 1985, February 1st, there was an uprising that was started by white supremacist guards, actually, called the Sons of Light. They belonged to a splinter group of the KKK, and they were searching cells, quote unquote. And Lincoln Love was what was the inmate who was targeted at the time. They went into his cell, flipped his cell, beat him with illegal billy clubs, tear gassed him, handcuffed him, and then dragged him out of the cell with his head bleeding, and threw him out and told the rest of the prisoners that this might happen to you. So, the Pendleton too, Balagoon and Naeem ultimately intervened to save his life. Like, this is the gist of the story. They first go to check on him to see what's going on. They're met with resistance from the guards. They initially tried to do this peacefully, when they were met with resistance from the guards, they had to defend themselves. The guards then attacked them, many of them being, members of the Sons of Light. Again, the KKK splinter group, the guards attacked them. They had to take hostages or to save their lives because the guards were trying to kill them. They occupied the prison for about 15 hours straight. No one died in that time. They called the media. They listed a series of demands, whether that was better the sanitary conditions or the unsanitary conditions in the prison, better food, more diverse guards, the ability to organize without any type of reprisal, and so on. And then, Naeem and Balagoon were sentenced to 142 and 84 years for this incident, although no one even died in it. And then they spent 20 years and about 33 years in solitary confinement, which is permanent torture. And then when Naeem tried to get his sentence vacated, or his sentence was vacated in 2018, and then they resentenced him to 122 years, having already spent 30 plus years in prison. So that's right now we're trying to organize, obviously, to bring awareness, to build out better programs, and it's a constantly evolving campaign to free the Pendleton too. Because, when you're doing something like this, you got to try a lot of diverse tactics, and you have to learn from what does work and what doesn't work. But I think it's important to highlight that for many reasons, but one, because like we were talking about, like disrupting things and, going against the grain of the mainstream narrative. It's one thing to do that rhetorically, like we're trying to do in media. It's another thing to do that in a very material, even physical way, and actually fight against, racist repression. And anytime someone does that, we should always have their back so we can enable everyone else to do the same thing. And when we don't have their back, we're sending a message, I think, to ourselves that, we're not ready to take that line, and we're not going to defend each other. And people are going to see that and not be willing to take those lines either. We want people to feel emboldened to do those things. That's why the state punishes political prisoners, because they don't want people to feel emboldened to do those kind of things. So we have to uplift these kind of people, because these folks are made examples of, to discipline the rest of our population to not rise up, to not fight back.
Do you want to answer this question? Because I'm actually kind of interested in it as well. Where James said solitary confinement is illegal. We all know that laws don't mean anything to them. But how do they? What method do they use? How do they technically get away with it too? Black, if you want to.
I mean, it's not actually illegal depending on where you go. It's been considered in an international sense as a human rights violation, as inhumane. Okay. But it's not illegal to lock someone in a separate cell for 23 hours in a dark cell. Sometimes not even.
I don't know why. I thought, like, in order to put someone in solitary confinement, there must be something there must be a charge. So according to what you're saying, they can just fucking do it.
They just make shit up. They say that this person is dangerous, and it was easy to do that with the Pendleton too, because they could say, well, they stabbed guards, they were involved in a whole uprising, so we need to separate them from the population. They even built what's called SHU units in Indiana, security housing units, which are just larger units of basically solitary confinement. And they started breaking up the prisoners who were part of the bigger, like, organizing apparatus inside prisons that were organizing against guards, and started putting them in these SHU units. Like, so they were building people to torture them more. I think Ruth Wilson Gilmore, I cannot remember with the country, but she said that these type of units were built because they could not pass the law. I cannot remember the country, so someone have to look this up. But they could not pass a law to just outright, like, they couldn't get the death penalty. So they built units like that as a means to kill folks. This is the original, like, where these kind of things come from, as a means to kill people, because they couldn't get a law to actually do it. Like, that's the kind of, like, history of it. I just cannot remember the country off the top of my head. So forgive me. But, like, so that's what these units are meant for. They're not meant to teach anybody, like, how to rehabilitate. They're meant to just cause a slow death. That's why it's also great that that Naeem and Balagoon are still alive and well and still fighting, despite having been in those conditions. And that same thing goes for Mumia. And I mean, these people, if you talk to them, they have great spirits, and it's just, like, amazing when you speak to them how they still have that, because a lot of us are understandably so, beat down off of even less.
Yeah, that's probably my greatest fear, dude. Like, being in solitary confinement, just the way I'm wired. Like I'm not. I swear to God, you might well kill me, man. Like I swear to God, I'd rather be killed than that. That's like, and that's what we mean when you say torture. Like that, they are torturing people. They are torturing their political prisoners. That's why I love the explanation, because I think it is very important, and it's rightfully so. We got a panel on Julian Assange later. Julian Assange get a lot of attention, but I don't think people like Mumia and Pendleton too get the attention that they deserve as well, because they are political prisoners the same way that Julian Assange is, the way I see it. And
Well,
I
that's
think
exactly.
yeah, go ahead,
I'm
go
sorry.
ahead.
That's exactly why we need independent radical Black media,
Exactly.
Yeah,
because there's a history of political prisoners in our community that date back, in this modern time to the late 60s and early 70s. People who were part of the Black Panther Party, part of the Black Liberation Army, part of the RNA, part of other political organizations and formations which decided to defend Black people, but part of George Jackson, Blood in My Eye. So these folks and others, right? And Mutulu Shakur, who's still locked down, other Black radicals who are still locked down. When I was coming up as a younger organizer in New York alone, there was like 8 to 9 Black Panther Party members who were in prison that we went to visit, that we supported their political cases, and little by little they've been released over the last 5 or 6 years, but only at a stage when they're much older, right? As folks in times have changed, and there's not a movement to the degree that there was around them. But that's exactly why we need independent black media. And you hit the nail on the head. Assange is a political prisoner and obviously needs support. But the idea that Assange somehow jumps ahead of the decades of time spent behind bars that a Mumia has had, and again, as a Mutulu Shakur has had, is something that is unfathomable, and something that we as Black media, as Black organizers, have to make sure that we put those folks' voices and stories out. And as Two Black said, these people are in prison because they were challenging the state, right? They challenged the state head on. And I all praises due to folks who challenge the state through media and through other things. But as folks who talk about organizing and radical change, you're not going to beat it because you put out a good news story, right? You're not going to beat it just because you expose documentation of what the wrongdoing is. They already know what the wrongdoing is. They may not want it out there, and they may stop you from doing it. But what they're really scared of is Black folks on the ground radicalizing other Black folks, organizing, taking affirmative action. And that's a scale of action. That's everything from civil disobedience to expropriations to radical action in the street, right? These folks were willing to do that, and they did do it to a lot of degree, and they have been punished by the state. And then the left, which is supposed to be a real left, ignores them because they're scared of the word violence, or they're scared of anything that doesn't fit into a narrative of quote unquote peaceful change, when we all know that peaceful change is just not enough in terms of fighting back against a capitalist white supremacist machine. And so that's the reason why we need radical media to do a counter narrative, to talk about the history of these people, to talk about the roles that they played in forming organizations that challenge the state, that challenge the police, that challenge the electoral politics arena, that challenge military intervention, that teamed up with governments overseas who were radical and revolutionary governments, that didn't limit their organizing to the bloc, or didn't limit their organizing to doing media, but decided that they were going to be part of a worldwide struggle for radical and revolutionary change. We need Black radical media to point that out, to talk about that, to hold these figures up as people who are part of our struggle, and that need to be not only studied, but who need to be, that we need to do the work that they did, carry on that work that they did in all phases of the understanding of what it means to do radical and revolutionary work.
that is so very well said, Kamal. And I want to, if cause we got a little bit of time left for because Two Black had a chance to explain the Pillington too for people who are not aware, because it's such a powerful point. Because Julian Assange do need defense, but these political prisoners that I admit, like I'm learning about Mumia, the Pillington too. I'm learning these people about like maybe the last year or two. I'm doing my real, and I'm like, because I got this media space now, and like you say, I've taken it upon myself. It's our being responsibility to bring these things up. We can't expect other people to bring it up. So that's why I love to have you guys on. That's why I love to talk about the topics with you guys. So for people who are not aware, as we wrap this segment up, do you want to briefly explain who Mumia is and why he classified as a political prisoner, Kamal?
I mean, really quickly, Mumia was a member of the Black Panther Party as a teenager. He was also a journalist, an organizer, and through his time as a party, he became what was considered a threat to the Philadelphia establishment. He covered MOVE. He later joined MOVE. He covered the antics of the state and trying to punish MOVE or oppress MOVE as a population. He
Who's move?
exposed.
Who's move?
MOVE was a radical political organization in Philadelphia who was creating, let's say, liberated territory, who were voicing discontent, voicing opposite opinions or opposing opinions to what the state was doing in the Black community. And the state attacked MOVE. They attacked MOVE in several different ways. They attacked them. Obviously, most people know about the bombing of the MOVE headquarters, which basically wiped out a whole block, killed 8 or 9 members of MOVE. But there were also other political attacks on MOVE. There was mass arrests against MOVE as an organization. They surrounded the community. They tried to demonize MOVE as an organization. And it doesn't mean that everything that MOVE did was sort of politically correct or I agreed with and everything else. But it does mean that the state considered them an enemy and then went after them. And Mumia tried to expose that. And for that, Mumia himself was targeted. And depending on who you ask, right, Mumia defended himself and or was it just strictly a victim of the state's move against him. Either way, Mumia ended up shot and in prison. It's been in prison for now over, if I'm not mistaken, 35, 40 years. And during that time period has also been on death row for most of that time period. And again, it's only been through the organizing of not only organizers and activists in the Black community and the white community, but it's only been through organizing that Mumia has not been murdered by the state. It's only been because we've lifted Mumia's case up that he was taken off of death row, but still given life imprisonment. But that was a struggle that's been taking place over 20 to 30 years. And so the fact that Mumia is not on death row, to talk about, again, somebody like Mutulu Shakur, who was a leader of the Black Liberation Army, who was involved in Brinks expropriations, and who was arrested and imprisoned because of that, because he was a leader in militant Black struggle. For us not to talk about these people means that we have sort of, again, either succumbed to someone else's narrative, or we're just too scared to say what is the true history of radical revolutionary struggle that we support and we should be involved in. So we got to uplift these people, talk about their work, talk about how their work may be continued, talk about the different areas that we may not be ready to expropriate something. And that means rob a bank, y'all, if you're not familiar with it. We may not be ready to expropriate something, but we have to be ready to be organizing folks in our community to fight back against the gentrification that's happening, against the police brutality that's happening, against the ways in which our communities are not allowed to have to prosper, to control our communities, to control our activities. At the very least, we got to be able to push back and fight back in that way. And so I think those things become extremely important in terms of why we need a true radical Black media outlet, so that we can bring people along, not only our own folks, but other people who want to know about that history, so that the word can be spread about what really radical organizing is.
Well said. That's such a great way to end this segment. I want to go to Two Black for any final words. Like, if you, let me frame it this way: any advice you would love to give any activist, but especially a young Black activist who want to elicit positive change in their community. So that's the theme on our end off part. But any last words you have, any last thing you want to promote before we send you off to, and we start Two Black and we go to Kamal next.
Yeah, I think as far as directly to that question, I mean, I would always say study. And when I say study, I don't just mean read books. That's a big part of it. But, you know, books are based on real life observations if they're any good, right? so you know, study. I just think that really helps you work through some of the things that you're up against if you're willing to study those things and, you know, find the resources and join in with other people to study. You know, because it's just, you know, we talked earlier about we didn't always have language for things, and we didn't have like an understanding or a framework for things. And I think it's particularly nowadays, like that lack of language or that lack of framework can lead people to very reactionary places because they're not studying. They just feel something. They have a rage, as I've written about, and figuring out how to like clarify that rage and clarify why you feel this way about the world as a Black person. Will help you avoid a lot of pitfalls early on if you're young. You don't have to be in so much BS, honestly, if you can study. And even when you find yourself in BS, it's easier to get out of it because you study. So I really implore people to do that. As far as things coming up, I mean, Black Miss Black Miss podcast is still going on BPM and all streaming platforms on the audio side. So we're doing an episode we just did last month that the myth that Marxism was Eurocentric, and that was fun. It was also fun to deal with all the trolls that came with that. And then and then this month we are doing the myth. I'm gonna try to explain this as briefly as I can because I know our time is limited. But the myth profiting off of Black death. This is based on my essay. I actually came on the show on this platform talk about laundering Black rage.
Yeah, we still gotta do part 2 soon, man.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, but in short, when people say profiting off of Black death, the argument is that Black people die every day. And most days there's no donations, there's no thoughts, there's no prayers, there's no investments, there's not any surplus of money that funnels into the community. We just die, we're just killed, but when our rage actually rises up and when we go to the streets, that creates the surplus. Then you see all the money come in, then you see all these things come in. So we just want to clarify like that process. So it's not that people don't profit off of Black death, but it's an incomplete understanding of that process. So that episode will be dropping tomorrow on Black Power Media, and then we'll be doing part 2 on Friday.
Yeah. Well, thank you for joining us. 2 Black. Kamal, any last words of encouragement for activists out there? Or where can they find you as well? Any last thoughts, Kamal?
Yeah, I mean, one, I think 2 Black's article was excellent. And so people need to read that as a form of study. Because I think anything that starts to talk about how the conditions of our folks impact the work that people do, I think that's a go-to article, and how people either take advantage of it, and how people can, and like you said earlier, maybe not intentionally take advantage of it, but quickly either fall in step to be taking advantage of it or are led to take advantage of it because of all the goodies that they receive as individuals for doing so. And so I think that article lays it out, and I think it's a great article to read. And lastly, I'll say, they can find me on Black Power Media, usually the morning show, Remix Morning Show, and they can find me in the community. So Community Movement Builders is the organization that I'm a part of. It's the organization that we do our work in terms of fighting gentrification, fighting police brutality, trying to create sustainable communities, organizing against what's called Cop City and some other things. So that's where you'll find me. And again, I stress, yes, people should be activists, but as you become an activist, know that it's not enough. Do what you can do, but for those who have the time, energy, and the willingness, move and shift your position from activist to organizer. Figure out organizations that you can be a part of and join. And if you can't find one that you like, then start one. Because the idea is that we have to organize and struggle to fight back against the oppression that we suffer from, which is based on white supremacy and capitalism. And so you get involved in that. That's what you got to do. And I think stations like this and stations like ours are helpful and hopefully in leading people to that path, so they can get involved in the community and do that work.
Yeah, that's such an important concept. I'm glad that you brought it up. I definitely got to give it some thought because it's such a brilliant concept. So thank you guys for joining us again. I also love that you guys brought political education because that's essentially what we covered yesterday. Yesterday we were talking about how important political education is. So you guys see why we have Black Power Media on, and I love the work that you guys do. Thank you for joining us.